The music pulsed through the house, a steady rhythm that seemed to sync with the laughter and chatter echoing off the walls. Ruby stood near the kitchen island, her fingers curled loosely around the stem of a glass of white wine. She took a small sip, her eyes scanning the room in search of something, or someone familiar. Nothing, just a sea of strangers, their faces lit with the kind of ease she couldn't quite muster. This wasn't her scene. It never had been. The host, an author she'd worked with once on a mid-list memoir, had invited her with such enthusiasm that she hadn't known how to refuse. Now she questioned that decision, feeling like a misplaced comma in an otherwise flowing sentence. Her gaze lingered briefly on a group in the corner, their laughter rising above the music. She envied their carefree air, but couldn't bring herself to join them. Instead, she tucked a strand of her auburn hair behind her ear and retreated further into herself. "Not a fan of house parties either, huh?" The voice came from her left, warm and easy, like a melody she couldn't quite place. She turned, and there he was, tall, with a mess of dark curls and a grin that didn't just reach his eyes. It lit them. He wore a denim jacket over a plain white t-shirt, and there was a sketchbook tucked under his arm, its edges worn and stained with smudges of charcoal. He looked like he belonged here, yet somehow separate from it all, like he'd stepped out of a story just to check if reality was worth staying in. Ruby straightened, caught off guard by his directness. "That obvious," she replied, tilting her glass toward him in mock surrender. He laughed, a low, genuine sound that immediately put her at ease. "Well, you were staring at the wall like it might offer you directions to the nearest exit. I'm Ethan, by the way." He extended his hand, his palm faintly smudged with graphite. "Ruby," she said as their hands met. His grip was firm but not overbearing, his touch warm against her skin. "Okay, Ruby," he said, leaning slightly closer as if sharing a secret. "What's your escape plan? Sneak out the back or fake a phone call?" She arched an eyebrow, her lips curving into a reluctant smile. "Who says I need an escape plan? Maybe I'm just observing." "Observing," he repeated, nodding as though he were considering the weight of the word. "So you're a watcher of people. Let me guess, writer?" "Editor," she corrected, the tension in her shoulders easing just a bit. "Close, though. I work with writers." "Ah," he said, his eyes brightening. "The unsung hero of storytelling. I've been on the receiving end of an editor's pen a few times, always brutal, always necessary." Ruby tilted her head, intrigued. "You're a writer?" "Not exactly," he said, holding up the sketchbook. "I'm an animator. My stories move, but they don't need words to do it." Her curiosity piqued. "What kind of animation?" "Mostly freelance stuff. Short films, commercials, the occasional music video, but the dream." He paused, glancing down at the sketchbook, as if it held some answer he wasn't ready to say aloud. "The dream is to create something that lasts. You know, something kids might watch 100 times until the VHS wears out, or whatever the digital equivalent of that is these days." Ruby's smile softened. "I get that. I spend my days chasing the same thing, even if it's for other people's work. Stories that stick with you, that make you feel like the world's a little bit bigger, or smaller, depending on what you need." Ethan studied her for a moment, his grin fading into something gentler. "That's a nice way to put it. And here I thought I was the only one at this party thinking about stuff like that." They fell into a rhythm after that, their conversation flowing as effortlessly as a melody. Ethan told her about the sketches in his notebook, half-finished characters waiting for their stories to unfold, and Ruby shared snippets of the books she'd worked on, the ones that had left a mark on her. Time slipped away, unnoticed, the noise of the party fading into the background as they occupied their own little world. "So," Ethan said eventually, glancing around as though noticing the party for the first time, "do you think we're the only ones here who'd rather talk about stories than whatever it is everyone else is doing?" Ruby shrugged, her smile lingering. "Probably, but I'm okay with that." "Me too." He shifted his sketchbook under his arm, his grin returning as he held her gaze. "Hey, I've got an idea. What if we put our heads together and make something? A story, I mean. Your words, my pictures. Think about it. Two outsiders teaming up to create something magical." She hesitated for a moment, caught between surprise and excitement. Then she nodded, a spark of possibility igniting in her chest. "Okay, let's do it." Ethan extended his hand again, this time not as a greeting, but but as the start of something. Ruby took it, her grip firm, her pulse quickening. In the middle of the bustling house party, surrounded by strangers, they had found each other, and the beginning of a story neither of them could yet imagine. The cafe was quiet, a welcome reprieve from the hum of the city outside. Afternoon light poured in through the tall windows, pooling amber on the worn wood floors and casting soft shadows on the mismatched tables. Ruby stirred her tea absently, her gaze fixed on Ethan's sketchbook lying open between them. She could see the edges of a drawing, a girl with a wide-brimmed hat standing on what appeared to be a bridge, her hair caught in an unseen wind. The strokes were bold yet careful, each line brimming with energy that seemed to hum off the page. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his denim jacket slung over the backrest, his coffee cradled in both hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them charged but unhurried, like a violin string held taut and waiting for the bow to draw across it. "So," he said finally, his voice breaking the quiet like a soft ripple across water. "Why books?" Ruby looked up from the sketchbook, startled by the question. "Why books?" she repeated, as though he'd asked her why she needed air or sunlight. "Because stories matter." "Sure," he said, his grin tugging at the corner of his mouth, "but lots of things matter. Why do books matter to you?" She paused, her fingers stilling against the spoon in her mug. "I guess it's because they're the one place where everything makes sense," she said slowly, as if piecing together the thought for herself as much as for him. Even when they're messy, even when they're heartbreaking, there's still an order to them. A beginning, a middle, an end. You can hold it in your hands, and even if the story wrecks you, at least you know it's complete. Ethan studied her, his expression open and thoughtful. "So you edit because, what? You want to help people get to that completeness?" She nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Something like that. I think every story deserves its best chance. And I don't know, maybe it's a little selfish too. I like being part of it, like I'm helping to create something that might outlast me." "That's not selfish," he said, shaking his head. "That's noble, actually." He said the word with a playful lilt, but there was sincerity in his eyes. Ruby tilted her head, her curiosity sparking. "What about you? Why animation? You could have chosen something simpler, writing, photography, but you've got this whole other layer, creating motion and life." Ethan set his coffee down, his fingers tapping lightly against the table's edge as he considered her question. "Because movement is magic," he said at last, his voice soft but sure. "You can take a flat page, a still image, and make it breathe. I remember watching old Disney movies as a kid and being blown away by how alive the characters felt, like they could step right out of the screen. I wanted to do that. I wanted to make stories that move, not just visually, but here." He tapped his chest, just over his heart. Ruby's smile widened, a mix of admiration and understanding warming her expression. "That's beautiful," she said. He shrugged, a faint flush creeping up his neck. "Maybe, or maybe it's just an excuse for me to avoid drawing static backgrounds." He grinned, and she laughed softly, shaking her head. Their conversation shifted then, flowing easily between their dreams and the responsibilities tied to them. Ruby spoke of the long nights spent poring over manuscripts, the pressure of balancing her personal vision with the author's intentions. Ethan shared stories of deadlines for freelance projects that left him bleary-eyed, of clients who didn't always share his enthusiasm for experimentation. "But it's worth it," Ruby said, her hands wrapped around her mug. "Even when it's exhausting, even when it feels thankless, because every now and then something clicks and you remember why you started in the first place." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the sketchbook between them. "Yeah, it's like you're building tiny bridges, you know? From one person's imagination to another's, and if you do it right, someone can cross it and feel less alone on the other side." Ruby's breath caught at the metaphor, her thoughts snagging on the image of the bridge in his sketch. "That's it," she said suddenly, her voice quiet but urgent. "That's exactly what stories are. Bridges." Ethan looked up at her, his brow furrowed in curiosity. "Go on." She leaned forward slightly, the tea forgotten. "The idea of a bridge, it's perfect for a children's story. It's something every kid understands instinctively, right? A way to get somewhere else. But it can also be anything. A journey, a connection. A leap of faith. His eyes lit up, the spark of inspiration catching fire. And it could be magical, he added, his hands moving as he spoke. Like, not just any bridge, but one that only appears for certain people. Or maybe it changes depending on who crosses it. Ruby nodded, her heart pounding with the thrill of an idea taking shape. And there could be a character who's lost, who doesn't know where they're going, but the bridge helps them figure it out. Yes, Ethan said, his grin spreading. And I could draw it. The kid, the bridge, the whole world around it. Her pulse quickened, her smile almost unstoppable now. We could do this, she said, her voice steady despite the excitement rushing through her. You and me, my words, your pictures, a children's book. Ethan held her gaze, his expression softening into something earnest and certain. Let's do it, he said, the words simple but brimming with promise. He reached across the table, his hand extended. Ruby hesitated only for a moment before she clasped it, her grip firm, her heart racing. Their palms stayed pressed together for a beat longer than necessary, the weight of possibility settling between them. And just like that, a bridge began to build. The late afternoon sun dipped lower as Ruby and Ethan stepped off the overgrown path and onto the weathered planks of the old railway bridge. It stretched over a quiet stream that wound its way through the outskirts of town, the water below catching glints of gold in the fading light. The bridge had an air of forgotten history, its iron railings mottled with rust and ivy creeping up from the edges, as if the forest had been trying to reclaim it for years. The wood beneath their feet groaned faintly with each step, but it felt solid despite its age, steadfast against time. Ethan slowed his pace, his sketchbook tucked under one arm as his free hand trailed along the cool iron railing. This is it, he said softly, almost as if speaking too loudly might disturb the place. This is the bridge. Ruby stopped beside him, her gaze sweeping from one end of the structure to the other. It was beautiful in a way she hadn't expected, unpolished and unassuming, yet brimming with character, the kind of place that seemed to carry stories in its bones. She took a deep breath, the air here fresher than in the city, tinged with the faint scent of earth and moss. It's perfect, she murmured, more to herself than to Ethan. He turned to her, his dark curls catching the sun where it broke through the tree canopy. You feel it too, don't you? He asked, his voice low and tinged with wonder. It's more than just a bridge. Ruby nodded, unable to explain the pull she felt toward the spot. There was something about it, something quiet and enduring. It wasn't just a setting for their story, it was part of the story itself. Ethan stepped closer to the edge, where the railing opened up to a clear view of the stream below. He crouched, balancing his sketchbook on his knee as he flipped to a blank page. I mean, look at this, he said, gesturing with his pencil at the way the sunlight pierced through the trees, scattering across the water. It's like the whole place is alive. Ruby moved to stand beside him, her arms crossed loosely in front of her as she studied the view. It's a bridge between worlds, she said after a moment, her voice thoughtful. On one side you have the forest, the wild, untamed part, and on the other, the open fields, like a promise of something new. It's a place to choose, to decide where you want to go. Ethan glanced up at her, his pencil pausing mid-stroke. Yeah, he said, his smile softening. That's exactly what it is, a crossroads. She looked down at him, her auburn hair catching the light as it shifted in the breeze. Do you think that's why we're here? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. I mean, why this place feels so right? Ethan's gaze held hers for a moment, unspoken understanding passing between them. Then he looked back at his sketchbook, the pencil moving again, quick and confident. Maybe, he said simply, or maybe it's just because it's beautiful, and we needed a little beauty today. Ruby smiled faintly, her eyes drifting back to the stream. She wanted to press him further, to ask if he believed in things like fate or serendipity. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she watched as a pair of birds darted across the sky, their wings catching the light for the briefest of moments before they disappeared into the trees. Ethan's voice broke the silence. I was thinking, he said, not looking up from his drawing, what if the bridge in the story isn't just a bridge? What if it's alive in its own way? Like, it knows who needs it. It only shows up for the people who are ready to cross it. Ruby's chest tightened, the thrill of inspiration sparking through her. And maybe it changes depending on who sees it, she added, her mind already leaping ahead. To one person, it's a solid stone bridge. To another, it's a rickety rope bridge over an endless void. It reflects who they are or what they're afraid of. Ethan grinned, his pencil moving faster now, sketching out rough shapes on the page. Yes, and it could shift as they cross it, like it's testing them, or guiding them. Ruby couldn't stop the smile that spread across her face, her earlier tension dissolving in the rush of creative energy. She knelt beside him, her fingers brushing the edge of his sketchbook as she pointed to the half-formed drawing. What if the main character doesn't even realize the bridge is magical at first, she said. They think it's just a bridge, a way to get from point A to point B. But the farther they go, the more they start to notice things, like the way the stars look closer, or how time feels slower. Ethan glanced at her, his grin softening into something warmer, more intimate. "You're good at this," he said quietly, his voice tinged with admiration. Ruby felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, but she brushed it off with a small laugh. "So are you," she said, her gaze dropping to the sketch. "This is going to be incredible." They stayed like that for a while, the two of them hunched over Ethan's sketchbook as the sun dipped lower and the world around them grew softer, quieter. It wasn't until the first stars began to appear in the deepening blue sky that they finally stood, brushing dirt from their knees and taking one last look at the bridge. Ethan slid his sketchbook under his arm, his free hand brushing against Ruby's as they turned to leave. "This place," he said, glancing back over his shoulder, "it feels like it belongs to us now." Ruby's heart skipped, the weight of his words settling over her. She didn't respond, but as they walked back down the path together, their shoulders brushing now and then, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. This place did belong to them. Or maybe, just maybe, they belonged to it. The twilight air was crisp and quiet as Ruby and Ethan made their way back to the railway bridge, the path familiar now after weeks of returning to the same spot. The sun hovered low on the horizon, casting the sky in streaks of amber and violet. Ruby carried a shoulder bag filled with drafts and notes, while Ethan had his ever-present sketchbook tucked under one arm. They didn't speak much on the walk. There was no need. The silence between them was comfortable, companionable, like the space between notes in a melody. When they arrived, the bridge looked almost otherworldly in the fading light. The ivy climbing its iron railings seemed to glow faintly, catching the last of the sun's rays. The planks of wood underfoot creaked softly, seeming to greet them like an old friend. Ruby set her bag down on the edge of the bridge and leaned on the railing, taking in the view of the stream below, which shimmered in the golden light. Ethan dropped his sketchbook onto the ground and crouched down, flipping it open to a blank page. "I swear, this place looks different every time we come here," Ethan said, glancing up at her as he sharpened a pencil with a small knife. "It's like it decides what mood it's in for the day." Ruby smiled, brushing her auburn hair out of her face as the wind teased it. "It does feel alive, doesn't it, like it's changing to match us somehow." He tilted his head, studying her. "What mood do you think it's in today?" Ruby considered this for a moment, her gaze drifting back to the stream. "Hopeful," she said finally, "like it knows we're getting closer to something." Ethan's grin was small but warm, and he nodded like she'd just confirmed something he'd been thinking himself. He began sketching, his pencil moving across the page in quick, deliberate strokes. Ruby pulled out her notes, like flipping through the pages until she found the section she'd been working on. A pivotal moment in their story where the main character finally understands the bridge's magic. As she worked, the minutes seemed to stretch and flex, the usual passage of time slipping into something looser, less defined. The sun lingered on the horizon longer than it should have, the light holding steady as if reluctant to give way to the night. Ruby noticed this only faintly at first, her focus on her writing, but as she paused to reread a line, she realized the golden hour had lasted far longer than usual. "Does it feel strange to you?" she asked, looking up at Ethan. He didn't stop sketching, but his brows furrowed slightly. "Strange how? Like, Time's moving differently, she said, glancing around. The gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, the birdsong, even the rhythm of the stream, it all felt quieter, slower, like the world had taken a deep breath and was holding it. It feels still. Ethan paused, his pencil hovering over the page. He stood, stretching his legs, and turned in a slow circle, taking in the bridge, the forest, the sky. His gaze lifted and his breath caught. "Ruby," he said softly, "look up." She followed his gaze, and her lips parted in wonder. The first stars had blinked into existence, but they were brighter than she'd ever seen them, sharper, more luminous, as if the light from each one had traveled not just through space but through something magical to reach them here. They sparkled against the deepening indigo of the sky, so vivid it felt like they were just out of reach. "Wow," she whispered, unable to look away. "It's incredible." Ethan stepped closer to her, his eyes still on the sky. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing to a cluster of stars that seemed to shimmer in a rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Ruby nodded, her breath shallow. "They're moving, like they're alive." They stood there for a long moment, the work forgotten, as the stars seemed to pulse and dance above them. The bridge, the forest, the stream, they all felt impossibly far away, as if the world had narrowed to just the two of them, and the endless sky above. Ethan broke the silence first. "You know," he said, his voice low, "if we put this in the book, no one would believe it." Ruby laughed softly, her gaze still skyward. "Maybe it's not for the book," she said, the words slipping out before she could think better of them. "Maybe it's just for us." He turned to her then, his expression thoughtful, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight. "Maybe," he said, his voice quieter now. "Some things are meant to be just ours." The air between them shifted, charged with something unspoken. Ruby felt her heart stutter, then settle into a rhythm that matched the star's glow. Ethan was so close now she could see the faint smudge of graphite on his cheek, the way the breeze tousled his curls. For a moment, she forgot about the book, the bridge, even the stars, and all she could focus on was him. Ethan smiled, soft and lopsided, and then he reached for her hand. "Come on," he said, his voice light but his grip steady. "We can't let the stars have all the fun." "What are you?" Ruby started, but he was already pulling her toward the center of the bridge. The planks creaked beneath their feet, the sound blending with the hum of the night. When they reached the middle, he stopped and turned to face her, his hand still holding hers. "No music this time," he said, his grin playful. "But I think we can manage." Ruby blinked, her pulse quickening. "You want to?" "Dance," he finished for her, his grin widening. "Yeah, I do." She laughed, the sound soft and disbelieving, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she let him guide her closer, her free hand finding its way to his shoulder. He rested his hand lightly on her waist, and they began to sway, their movements slow and unhurried, matching the rhythm of the world around them. The stars seemed to shine even brighter as they moved, their light wrapping around the two of them like a celestial spotlight. Ruby felt a warmth bloom in her chest, spreading through her limbs, making her feel weightless. Time stretched again, the moment expanding until it felt endless. As they danced, Ethan leaned in slightly, his voice a soft murmur close to her ear. "This," he said, "feels like magic." Ruby nodded, her heart too full for words. Because it did. It felt like magic, like they'd stumbled into a moment that wasn't meant to be found, a secret the universe had decided to share with just the two of them. And for the first time in a long time, Ruby didn't try to explain it. She just let herself believe. The stars were scattered across the velvet sky, a dazzling array of light that seemed to draw closer as the night deepened. Ruby stood at the center of the railway bridge, her arms resting lightly on the iron railing, her gaze fixed on the stream below. The water reflected the night like a mirror, rippling softly with the occasional movement of a breeze. She exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cool spring air, and tried to focus on the stillness around her. But the quiet wasn't enough to calm the restless energy coursing through her. Behind her, Ethan sat cross-legged on one of the wide planks, his sketchbook open in his lap. She could hear the soft scratch of his pencil against the page, a sound as familiar to her now as the rhythm of her own heartbeat. He was humming something under his breath, a low and lilting tune that she couldn't place, but she didn't ask him about it. Talking would break the spell the evening had cast over them. and she wasn't ready for that. The past few weeks of working together had been a blur of inspiration and late nights, of shared ideas and stolen laughter. But lately, there had been something else. A new awareness that neither of them had spoken aloud, though it hovered constantly in the space between their words. Ruby felt it now, in the way her pulse quickened when she thought about turning around, about looking at him. It was maddening and wonderful all at once. "Hey," Ethan called out softly, breaking the silence. His voice was warm, like freshly brewed coffee. "You're awfully quiet over there. Everything okay?" Ruby glanced over her shoulder, her lips curving into a small smile. He was sitting with his knees bent now, his sketchbook closed and forgotten beside him. His dark curls were even messier than usual, and there was a smudge of graphite on his cheek. He looked impossibly relaxed, like he belonged here, like he belonged everywhere. "I'm fine," she said, "just thinking." "About?" She hesitated, not sure how to put it into words. "About this place. About us. About how?" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "It's nothing. Never mind." But Ethan wasn't one to let things go so easily. He stood and stretched, then walked over to her, his boots scuffing softly against the aged wood. When he stopped beside her, he leaned against the railing, his shoulder brushing hers. The contact sent an unexpected thrill through her, and she hoped he couldn't tell. "About how what?" He pressed gently, his gaze steady on her face. Ruby let out a soft laugh, looking down at the stream again. "About how it feels like time works differently when we're here, like the world slows down just for us." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, to her surprise, he said, "You're right. It does feel that way. Like this bridge exists outside of everything else. Like it's ours." His words settled over her like a blanket, warm and unshakable. She turned to look at him then, and the breath caught in her throat. The way he was watching her, his dark eyes reflecting the faint glow of the stars, made her chest tighten. Her usual composure faltered, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. Before she could recover, Ethan grinned, breaking the spell. "You know what we need?" "What?" she asked, grateful for the distraction. "A dance," he said, stepping back and holding out his hand to her. Ruby blinked, caught completely off guard. "A dance? Yeah, right here, right now." His grin widened, playful and full of mischief. "No music required." She let out a disbelieving laugh. "You're insane." "Maybe," he admitted, his hand still extended. "But come on, Ruby, humor me. You need to loosen up, and I need to see if editors can keep rhythm." Ruby hesitated, her heart pounding. Every instinct told her to make a joke, to deflect, to brush it off. But something in the way he was looking at her made it impossible to say no. With a resigned sigh, she placed her hand in his. His fingers curled around hers, warm and firm, and he pulled her gently toward the center of the bridge. The planks creaked beneath their feet as they moved, the sound blending with the quiet hum of the night. When they stopped, Ethan placed one hand lightly on her waist, the other still holding hers. Ruby rested her free hand on his shoulder, her touch tentative. "There," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Not so bad, right?" She laughed, shaking her head. "You're ridiculous." "Maybe," he said again, his grin softening, "but you're still here." They began to sway, their movements slow and unhurried, guided by a rhythm only they could feel. The stars above seemed to brighten, their light spilling over the bridge like a spotlight. Ruby's initial awkwardness melted away as she let herself get lost in the moment. The warmth of Ethan's hand on her waist, the gentle sway of their bodies, the way his gaze held hers, it all felt like magic. As they moved, Ethan leaned in slightly, his voice a low murmur. "You know, I think we're better at this than I thought we'd be." Ruby smiled, her cheeks flushing. "Maybe it's the setting, hard to go wrong with a bridge under the stars. Or," he said, his tone teasing, "maybe we just make a good team." She didn't respond, but she didn't need to. The look in her eyes said everything. And when Ethan's hand slid from her waist to the small of her back, pulling her just a fraction closer, Ruby didn't resist. Instead, she let herself lean into him, her heart pounding in a way that felt both terrifying and right. The dance slowed to a stop, but neither of them moved to pull away. Instead, they stood there, close enough to feel each other's breath, the air between them charged with anticipation. Ethan's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, and Ruby felt her world tilt. For a moment, the only thing that existed was him, and then, as if drawn together by a force they couldn't resist, Ethan leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was soft, tentative, and impossibly sweet. Ruby's eyes fluttered closed, and she let herself fall, the last of her resistance dissolving in the warmth of his touch. When they finally pulled back, the stars seemed brighter, the world quieter, and the bridge beneath them more solid than ever. Ethan smiled, his forehead resting lightly against hers. "See?" he said, his voice a breath against her skin. "No music needed." The air smelled of rain, though the storm had passed hours ago. Ruby sat cross-legged on the railway bridge, her notebook balanced on her thighs as she scribbled furiously against the page. Ethan was sprawled beside her, his back resting against the iron railing, sketchbook propped on his bent knees. His pencil moved in long, fluid strokes, capturing something Ruby couldn't see yet but knew would be beautiful. "Read that last bit again," Ethan said without looking up, his voice low and easy against the backdrop of the murmuring stream below. Ruby paused, biting her lip as she scanned her notes. "All right," she said hesitantly, clearing her throat. The bridge swayed beneath her feet, not from the wind, but from the weight of her uncertainty. Yet, as she stepped forward, the planks steadied, as if they, too, had been waiting for her all along. She glanced at him, her cheeks warming. "Too much?" Ethan shook his head, his curls falling into his eyes as he smiled. "Not even close. It's perfect." He tilted his sketchbook toward her, revealing the image he'd been working on. A girl standing uncertainly on the bridge, her hair caught in an invisible wind, the wooden planks beneath her glowing faintly with a soft golden light. Ruby stared at it, her heart catching. "Ethan," she breathed, "you brought her to life." "Team effort," he said, leaning his head back against the railing as he grinned at her. "You gave her a soul. I just gave her a face." She didn't reply, couldn't. The sincerity in his voice disarmed her, as it always did. She let her gaze drift back to the drawing, swallowing the knot of emotion building in her throat. "You okay?" Ethan asked, his tone softening. Ruby nodded, blinking away the warmth in her eyes. "Yeah, just thinking about how lucky I am to be doing this with you." Ethan's grin faded into something quieter, something that made her chest ache in the best way. He set his sketchbook aside and shifted closer, his knee brushing hers as he studied her face. "I think," he said, lowering his voice, "that I'm the lucky one." The space between them felt impossibly small now. Ruby's pulse raced as his hand rose, hesitating for a moment before tucking a stray strand of her hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, warm and steady, and the rest of the world seemed to fall away. "Ethan," she began, but before she could finish, his lips were on hers. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but it deepened as she leaned into him, her hand finding its way to the back of his neck. The taste of him, the warmth of his touch, the way he held her like she was something fragile and precious, it was enough to leave her breathless. When they finally parted, their foreheads rested together, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. Ethan's thumb brushed lightly over her cheek, and he whispered, "You're not just my partner in this, Ruby. You're my everything." Ruby closed her eyes, her heart swelling as she whispered back, "And you're mine." The air on the bridge felt heavier than usual, the crispness of spring dulled by an unspoken tension. Ruby stood near the edge, arms crossed tightly against her chest. Her notebook was open on the railing, pages fluttering slightly in the breeze, but she hadn't written a word in over 20 minutes. Behind her, Ethan paced back and forth, his sketchbook clutched in one hand, the other running through his hair in restless frustration. "I'm not saying your idea is bad, Ruby," Ethan said, his voice sharper than usual. "I'm just saying it doesn't fit anymore. The ending we talked about, the one where the bridge disappears after the kid crosses it. That's the payoff. That's the point. Changing it now doesn't make sense." Ruby turned to face him, her jaw tight. "And I'm saying it does make sense. The bridge shouldn't disappear. It should stay, Ethan. It's not just a means to an end. It's a symbol of what the kids learned, a reminder that they can always find their way back." She exhaled sharply, trying to steady herself. "You're so focused on the visuals, but this is about the story. The story is what matters." Ethan froze mid-step, his expression darkening. "Excuse me?" You think I don't care about the story? His voice was quieter now, but no less charged. I've poured just as much of myself into this as you have, Ruby. Maybe more. Every single drawing, every detail. I've been trying to bring your words to life. And now you're saying I don't care? That's not what I said, Ruby shot back, though her voice wavered. But sometimes it feels like you're more interested in how it looks than what it means. Ethan laughed, but it was a short, bitter sound. Right, because it's not like you've rewritten the same scene 10 times just to make it sound more poetic, even though it worked fine the first time. But sure, I'm the one who's too focused on the surface. Ruby's cheeks flushed with anger, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. This isn't about me being a perfectionist. This is about doing what's best for the story. And if you can't see that... What? Ethan cut in, stepping closer now. If I can't see that, then what? She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. The space between them felt like a chasm, the easy connection they'd shared just weeks ago now fraying at the edges. Ruby looked away, her gaze dropping to the stream below. The water, usually so calming, only seemed to mirror the turbulence she felt inside. Ethan sighed, the fight draining out of him. Ruby, he said softly, but his voice was laced with exhaustion. We're not going to get anywhere like this. Maybe we need to take a step back. Some space. Ruby's stomach twisted at his words, but she said nothing. Instead, she nodded stiffly and turned back to her notebook, though her vision blurred as she stared at the blank page. Ethan lingered for a moment longer, as if he wanted to say something else. But then he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance. Ruby didn't look up. When the last echoes of his presence disappeared, she let her head fall into her hands, the weight of their unraveling sinking in. For the first time since they'd found the bridge, it didn't feel magical, it just felt empty. The evening sky was streaked with deep purples and navy blues, the last light of the sun fading behind the distant hills as Ruby and Ethan approached the railway bridge. The air smelled faintly of damp earth from the rain earlier that day, and the wooden planks beneath their feet gleamed faintly, still slick with moisture. Neither of them spoke. Their footsteps echoed softly, the only sound besides the gentle murmur of the stream below. Ruby hugged her notebook against her chest, her fingers tightening around its worn edges. The bridge looked the same as it always had, timeless, waiting, but for the first time it felt unfamiliar. The air here used to hum with magic, with possibility. Now it felt heavier, weighed down by the silence between them. She glanced at Ethan out of the corner of her eye. He was walking a step ahead, his sketchbook tucked under one arm, his other hand shoved into the pocket of his jacket. His face was unreadable, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. When they reached the middle of the bridge, Ethan stopped suddenly and placed his sketchbook on the railing. Ruby hesitated before stepping beside him, setting her notebook down next to his. She rested her hands on the cool iron railing and looked down at the stream. The water moved sluggishly, as if even it had grown tired. "So," Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, careful. "Here we are." "Here we are," Ruby echoed, not looking at him. She traced a finger along the damp surface of the railing, her mind reaching for something, anything to say that wouldn't feel like picking at an old wound. Ethan sighed and leaned against the railing, his shoulders slumping. "I thought maybe if we came back here..." His voice trailed off, and he shook his head, as if scolding himself for even thinking it. Ruby turned to face him, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his expression. "I thought the same thing," she admitted softly. "I thought maybe this place could fix us." Ethan met her gaze then, his dark eyes searching hers. "Do you think it can?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she let her eyes drift to the far end of the bridge, where the ivy clung stubbornly to the railings, its leaves glinting faintly in the dim light. "I don't know," she said at last, "but I think maybe we need to stop expecting the bridge to do all the work." He blinked, caught off guard, and then a faint smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "You always know how to make me feel like I'm missing something obvious." Ruby smiled faintly, but before she could respond, her attention was drawn to a cluster of stones near the edge of the railing. Something was tucked between them. A corner of fabric, maybe, or paper. She frowned and stepped closer, crouching down to pull it free. "What's that?" Ethan asked, moving to stand beside her. "I don't know," Ruby said, carefully working the object loose. It was a small, leather-bound notebook, its edges worn and softened by time. The cover was damp from the rain, but the leather was intact, its surface etched faintly with initials, A+J. Ruby glanced up at Ethan, her brow furrowed. "Looks like someone left it here a long time ago." Ethan crouched beside her as she opened the notebook carefully, the pages crinkling as they separated. Inside, the handwriting was faded but elegant, looping letters written in black ink. The first page bore a simple inscription, "For the bridge that knows all secrets." Ruby's breath caught, and she turned to the next page. It was filled with lyrics, lines of poetry that seemed to hum with emotion, even in their faded state. As she flipped through, she found more. Melodies sketched out in careful notations, fragments of love letters, and small penciled drawings of the bridge at various times of day. Ethan leaned closer, his shoulder brushing hers as he looked over the pages. "It's beautiful," he said softly, almost reverently. "Whoever they were, they must have spent a lot of time here. Look." He pointed to a page where the handwriting had grown bolder, more urgent, as if whoever had written it had been caught up in a rush of feeling. "This bridge is ours. It always will be." Ruby felt a lump rise in her throat. The words felt impossibly familiar, like a whisper of something she couldn't quite grasp. She glanced at Ethan, and he was already looking at her. "It's like," he began, his voice trailing off as he searched for the right words. "It's like they were us, or like we're them. I don't know how to explain it." Ruby nodded, her fingers brushing over the inked words. "It's like the bridge remembers." They fell silent, the weight of the discovery settling over them. Ruby turned another page, and her breath caught again. There was a final note, written in the same looping script. "When you feel lost, build something together. That's where the magic lives." Ethan exhaled softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe the bridge didn't just bring us here to fix us. Maybe it was trying to remind us why we started. Ruby looked at him, her chest tightening at the quiet hope in his expression. For the first time in weeks, she felt that same hope stir in her, tentative but real. She closed the notebook carefully and placed it back among the stones where it belonged. When she straightened, Ethan was standing close, his sketchbook in hand. He held it out to her, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "What do you say we build something together?" Ruby smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. She reached for her notebook, flipping it open to a blank page, and nodded. "Let's do it." The stars were veiled tonight, hidden behind a blanket of clouds that seemed to press down against the world. The railway bridge was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden planks underfoot and the steady rush of the stream below. Ruby sat cross-legged near the middle of the bridge, her notebook resting open in her lap. Ethan leaned against the iron railing a few feet away, his guitar perched on his knee, fingers idly strumming a soft, wandering tune. They hadn't come here with a plan. After discovering the old notebook hidden among the stones, they'd both felt an unspoken pull to return, carrying with them only their tools, Ruby's pen, Ethan's guitar. Between them, perched on the railing, lay the leather-bound notebook from the past, its faded lyrics and sketches silently urging them forward. Ethan's fingers paused on the strings, a chord hanging in the air like a question. "What if we start with this?" he asked, glancing at the open page of the old notebook. His voice was hesitant, tentative. "These lines here." He pointed to a verse scrawled in a looping hand, "Where the bridge meets the sky, where the stars forget time." Ruby leaned forward, brushing her hair behind her ear as she read the words again. They resonated differently now, as if their meaning had shifted. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "but it feels unfinished, like there's something still waiting to be said." "Exactly." Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile, his fingers returning to the strings. He played the chords again, this time more deliberately, letting the notes rise and fall, soft and yearning. "What would you add?" he asked, his gaze flicking to her. Ruby tilted her head, her pen tapping against her notebook as she let Ethan's melody draw the words out of her. "Maybe something about finding your way," she murmured, thinking aloud. about knowing you're not alone, even when you feel like you're standing on the edge of everything. Ethan's fingers faltered, the music pausing. He looked up at her, his brow furrowed but his expression tender. "That's exactly it," he said quietly. "That's what the bridge has always been for us, hasn't it? A place where everything feels bigger and smaller at the same time. Where it's okay to be lost, as long as you're not lost alone." Ruby's pen moved swiftly now, the words spilling onto the page as if they'd been waiting all along. "Where the bridge holds the stars, where the world stands apart, you'll find a way home if you follow your heart." She stopped, glancing up at Ethan to gauge his reaction. He smiled, the kind that reached his eyes and warmed the air between them. "That's it," he said simply, his voice thick with admiration. "Keep going." Word by word, note by note, they worked together, the song taking shape like clay under careful hands. Ethan's guitar became the pulse, steady and alive, while Ruby's words gave it flesh and breath. They didn't overthink it, didn't argue or hesitate. It was effortless, the kind of collaboration that reminded them why they'd started all of this in the first place. As the final verse came together, Ethan leaned into the melody, his voice low and raw as he hummed the first tentative lines. Ruby watched him, her chest tightening with a familiar ache, the good kind, the kind that came from creating something that mattered. She joined him softly, the words slipping from her lips like a promise, their voices weaving together in the cool night air. When the last note faded into the quiet, they sat still for a moment, the weight of their creation settling gently between them. Ethan set his guitar aside, his lips curving into a grin that was soft and a little disbelieving. "We did it," he said, as if the realization had just struck him. Ruby smiled back, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "Yeah," she said, "we did." And in that moment, the bridge felt magical again. The railway bridge hummed with quiet energy, a liminal space between night and morning as the first soft streaks of dawn crept into the sky. Ruby and Ethan stood at its center, side by side, their breaths clouding faintly in the crisp air. The stream below mirrored the pinks and golds stretching across the horizon, and the world around them felt hushed as though holding its breath. Ruby clutched her phone in one hand, its screen glowing faintly in the pre-dawn light. A simple post stared back at them, a link to their song, now live for the world to hear, accompanied by a caption that read, "This is for the dreamers, the lost, and those still searching. We hope you hear it the way we felt it." Her thumb hovered over the publish button, her heart pounding. Ethan's hand found hers, steadying her, his fingers curling gently around hers. "You ready?" he asked, his voice low, warm, and familiar. She turned to him, her lips curving into a small, nervous smile. "I think so. Are you?" He nodded, the light catching in his dark eyes as he squeezed her hand. "Yeah, let's do it." Ruby exhaled slowly and pressed the button. For a moment, nothing changed. There was no great shift, no cosmic announcement that their creation was now out in the world. But something inside her shifted, like a knot she hadn't realized she was holding had finally loosened. She glanced up at Ethan, who was already grinning. "It's done," she said softly, almost as if trying to convince herself. "It's done," he echoed, his grin widening. He slid his phone back into his pocket and stepped closer, his hands settling lightly on her arms. Ruby looked down at the stream for a moment, watching the water ripple and dance with the first touches of light. "Do you think people will feel it?" she asked, her voice quiet, vulnerable. Ethan tipped her chin up gently, meeting her gaze. "I think they will. But even if they don't, we did. That's what matters, Ruby." Her chest tightened, a flood of emotions rushing through her. Relief, pride, love. She didn't answer, couldn't find the words, so she reached for him instead. Ethan's arms wrapped around her as she buried her face against his shoulder, his warmth grounding her as the bridge seemed to embrace them both. "This is ours," she murmured, her voice muffled against him. "Always." Ethan pressed his lips to her hair, holding her closer. "Always."